Chapter 1. Maggie and Tom. Dorlcote Mill stood near a stone bridge on the river Floss, not far from the town of St Ogg's, where the tributary Ripple joined the big river. The Floss was a lively river, and the sounds of the rushing water, the mill wheel, and the booming machinery were a constant accompaniment to life in the mill house. Mr. Tulliver, the owner of the mill, was a down-to-earth and outspoken man. He lived at the mill house with his wife and his 9-year-old daughter. His son, Tom, who was 13, was away at school. Tom was not an intellectual boy, and he hadn't made much progress in his studies, but Mr. Tulliver had ambitions for him. He wanted Tom to make a good career as a businessman, instead of working in the mill in the usual way. He especially wanted him to be properly educated, to be able to deal with the lawyers who had caused so much trouble in his own life. It was obvious that he needed more education than the local school could offer. Maggie, Mr. Tulliver's daughter, was also a worry to him, but for the opposite reason. She was far cleverer than her brother and spent all her time reading books and asking difficult questions. Mr. Tulliver loved her dearly, but felt that it was a shame she wasn't a boy. Everyone knew that too much learning could only lead to trouble for a girl. Mr. Tulliver had deliberately chosen an unintellectual woman for his own wife. Mrs. Tulliver's world revolved around practical, domestic concerns. She too was worried about Maggie, but her worries were about her daughter's wild behaviour and her lack of interest in her appearance. The girl wouldn't even let her mother curl her hair. Mrs. Tulliver's sisters were all very particular about appearances, and Lucy, her niece, was such an angelic, well-behaved child. What would all her relations think of her gypsy daughter? On the night before Tom's last day at the academy, Mr. Tulliver invited a friend, Mr. Riley, to the mill to discuss the next stage in his education. Mr. Riley secretly knew nothing about schools or teachers, but he didn't like to appear ignorant when someone was asking his opinion, so he recommended a tutor called Stelling, whom he vaguely knew. Mrs. Tulliver was alarmed to hear that Tom would have to live at Mr. Stelling's house with a number of other boys if he wanted to study with the tutor.
"What will they give him for his breakfast?"
she cried.
"Who will wash his clothes?"
Maggie was worried that the school was far away. She wouldn't be able to visit her beloved brother often enough. The next day, to pass the time while she was waiting for Tom's return, Maggie went to watch Luke, the head miller, at work. Luke wasn't interested in any of the books that Maggie wanted to lend him, so she talked to him about Tom instead.
"When we are older, Luke,"
she explained,
"Tom and I will live together, and I will be his housekeeper because I love him more than anybody in the world. He's so clever. He knows all about making things and about birds, fish, and animals."
"In that case,"
said Luke,
"he won't be very pleased to find that his pet rabbits are all dead."
Maggie was horrified. Tom had asked her to feed the rabbits while he was away at school, but she had been busy with her books and had forgotten. When Mr. Tulliver brought Tom home in the carriage later that day, Mrs. Tulliver and Maggie covered him in kisses. He pretended to be unconcerned, but he was pleased to see his funny little sister. He had a surprise for her, a fishing line and a hook.
"I'll take you fishing, by the round pool,"
he promised. Maggie was ecstatic.
"But first, I want to go and see my rabbits."
"Oh, Tom,"
said Maggie.
"something terrible has happened. The rabbits are all dead. It's my fault because I didn't feed them."
Tom's face grew angry.
"Maggie, how could you?"
he cried.
"I don't love you anymore. And I don't believe that you love me. You should have taken more care."
Maggie was heartbroken. She ran to her secret hiding place, the attic, and cried there all afternoon. Tom, on the other hand, went to visit Luke and soon forgot all about the rabbits. At tea time, when no one else could find Maggie, he went up to the attic to fetch her, and they soon made friends again. The next day, they went fishing as Tom had promised, and Maggie felt she was in heaven. Chapter 2. The Aunts and Uncles. Mrs. Tulliver's 3 sisters and their husbands had been invited to Dorlcote Mill for Easter, so Mrs. Tulliver and the servant had spent the week in the kitchen preparing a vast quantity of food to impress them. Aunt Glegg was the first of the aunts to arrive. She was the oldest and was dressed as usual in old clothes that she had mended and altered many times. Aunt Glegg didn't believe in wasting money, unlike Aunt Pullet, who arrived soon after in a fine carriage and elegant clothes. The last aunt to arrive was Aunt Dean, a quiet and respectable woman who had married a rich man. Her pretty daughter, Lucy, was a year younger than Maggie, and both Tom and Maggie were very fond of her. They rushed in to greet her, ignoring their aunts and uncles. The aunts were offended by this behaviour and began to criticise their sister's impolite children. As usual, they also criticised Maggie's appearance, especially her untidy hair. Maggie was angry and rushed upstairs. The aunts agreed that Maggie had all the characteristics of her father's family, and none of their own Dodson family. Tom followed Maggie upstairs and was amazed to find her in her bedroom, cutting off her long hair with a large pair of scissors.
If I cut it off,
She explained.
they won't be able to criticise it anymore.
Maggie felt proud and strong, but when Tom laughed at her and told her how silly she looked, she started to cry. She was too ashamed now to go downstairs with him for dinner. After a while, Tom came up again to tell her that she was going to miss the pudding if she didn't come down, and he laughed at her sad face. Maggie couldn't understand how Tom could enjoy his dinner when she was so upset. Why was he so unfeeling? But eventually she came downstairs and went to sit between Lucy and Tom. There was silence as everybody stared at the remains of her hair. Mrs. Tulliver cried out in horror and dropped a spoon into her best dish, breaking it into 100 pieces. The uncles tried to make jokes about the situation, but the aunts were all horrified. Maggie couldn't bear their scrutiny and ran to her father.
Don't worry about what they say,
He said kindly.
I'll take your part. It doesn't matter.
After lunch, Mr. Tulliver announced his plans for Tom's education to the aunts and uncles. Not everybody was enthusiastic. "Why do you want him to have so much education?" asked Mr. Glegg.
Private tutors are expensive.
Said Mr. Dean.
You shouldn't waste your money on such things.
And some of it's my money anyway.
Added Aunt Glegg.
Don't forget that I lent you £500, Tulliver. You don't seem to be in a hurry to pay it back. I always said that Sister Bessie married beneath her when she married you.
My family is as good as yours,
Shouted Mr. Tulliver furiously.
and there aren't any bad-tempered women in the Tulliver family.
Aunt Glegg stormed out of the house, and the party ended badly. Mr. Tulliver promised himself that he would find the £500 as soon as possible to repay that dreadful woman. Most people thought that Mr. Tulliver had a lot of money, but the truth was that he had not yet repaid the mortgage on the mill, and he was always spending money on expensive lawsuits. He had a good heart and often lent his friends money without any written documents, but he could never bear to insist on getting it back. Now that he was in difficulty, he remembered that his sister and her husband owed him £300. He decided to ride over to their farm that day and ask for the money, but when he saw his sister, Gritty, his heart softened. She and her husband, Mr. Moss, were poor farmers with 8 children. They had many financial problems, and she was exhausted with working and looking after the children. Ignorant of the reason for his visit, she was delighted to see her brother and wanted to hear all about Maggie and Tom. Unlike the Dodson aunts, Mrs. Moss admired Maggie, and she always wanted her to come and visit her cousins.
I hope that Tom will be a good brother to Maggie, as you have been to me in all my troubles,
She said, smiling at Mr. Tulliver. Mr. Tulliver knew that after this he could not insist on the money, so he left without it, and without any promise of repayment. Chapter 3. Family Quarrels. The next day, Mrs. Tulliver took Maggie, Tom and Lucy to visit the Pullets. Mr. Pullet was a wealthy gentleman farmer, and his farm was very neat and well kept. The children always enjoyed visiting the farm because there were lots of interesting animals for them to play with. The large house was extremely clean and tidy too. In fact, Aunt Pullet was terrified of dirt, and most of the floors and furniture had permanent covers over them to keep them clean. The children were soon sent outside to play.
Make sure you stay on the paths.
Cried Aunt Pullet.
Don't go into the fields and get dirty.
When the children had gone, the conversation turned to yesterday's quarrel with Aunt Glegg.
I'm so worried that Jane is offended,
confessed Mrs. Tulliver.
Can't you speak to her about it, sister, and ask her to make up with my husband? Your husband always was obstinate, Bessie,
said Aunt Pullet.
And when he dies, don't suppose he'll have any money to leave you. He has his sister and all her children to maintain, and he's always spending money on those lawsuits. I feel sorry for you, Bessie. It will all end badly, I'm sure.
Mrs. Tulliver had started to cry, and Aunt Pullet softened towards her.
I suppose I could drive over tomorrow and speak to Jane,
she said.
After all, we don't want other people saying that we have quarrels in our family.
At that moment the door opened and Lucy appeared crying desperately, one side of her white dress and bonnet completely covered in mud. Aunt Pullet began to panic at the entrance of all this dirt into her house, while Mrs. Tulliver, certain that her children were to blame, ran outside to find them. What the women didn't know was that Maggie and Tom had quarrelled earlier. Tom had made Maggie jealous by paying attention to Lucy. He had taken Lucy to look at the fish in the pond. He told Maggie to go away, and, overcome with jealousy, she had angrily pushed Lucy into the mud. Maggie decided then to run away. She was going to go and live with the gypsies. After all, everyone always said that she was like a gypsy, so she reasoned that she should go and live with her true family. After a long walk, she found what she was looking for, a group of gypsy women cooking around a fire in a field. It was certainly true that they looked like her. They were very dark and had long, untidy hair. Maggie announced to the gypsy women that she had come to live with them, that she could teach them things and even become their queen if they wanted. The women were polite to her, called her Little Lady, and asked if she came from a big house. Maggie was pleased by this, but when she asked for something to eat and they gave her only a piece of old bread and some bacon, she began to wish she was at home. When the gypsy men arrived and inspected the contents of her pockets, she started to feel afraid. The men asked her where she lived and said that they would take her home if she would say that they had been kind to her. One of the men sat her on a donkey in front of him, and they set off down the lane. It was dark now, and Maggie was terrified. Then she spotted her father approaching them on his horse. With a cry of happiness, she jumped off the donkey and ran to him. Mr. Tulliver hugged her.
"What would I do if I lost my little girl?"
he asked her. The next day, Aunt Pullet went to Aunt Glegg's house to try to make peace. Aunt Glegg had already repented of her hard words to her brother-in-law and had decided not to insist on repayment. But that evening she received a proud letter from Mr. Tulliver assuring her that she could have her £500 as soon as possible. Aunt Glegg and the others knew that this meant Tulliver would have to borrow the money to repay her and get himself into even more debt. The aunts marvelled at his obstinacy and pride. Aunt Glegg could not help her sister now, even if she wanted to. Tulliver had outmanoeuvred her. Chapter 4. School Days. When Tom started school at Mr. Stelling's, he found the lessons abstract and difficult. Neither he nor his father could understand how learning Latin and geometry would help him in his future career, but they assumed that Mr. Stelling must know best. Stelling was a strict tutor who, if a student didn't understand a lesson, punished him by giving him even more work. It was not his fault, he said. if a boy was too stupid to learn. At Christmas time, Tom went home for the holidays. The Moss family came to Dorlcote Mill for Christmas Day, but the party was rather spoiled by Mr. Tulliver. He was angry because a farmer who had a farm further up the River Ripple was starting an irrigation scheme for his farm. Mr. Tulliver felt sure that this scheme would deprive him of enough water to power his mill. In actual fact, Mr. Tulliver didn't know the details of the scheme, but he was certain that he was in the right, and that his enemy, the lawyer Wakeham, must be involved in the case. Wakeham was a clever but ruthless lawyer who had humiliated Mr. Tulliver in the past. Mrs. Tulliver and Mrs. Moss were worried that Mr. Tulliver's obsession with the irrigation scheme and his hatred for Wakeham would result in another lawsuit. That night, Tom nervously told his father that the next term there would be another boy studying at Mr. Stelling's too. This boy was Philip Wakeham, the son of Wakeham the lawyer, and Tom thought his father would be angry. But Mr. Tulliver only said,
The boy is a poor creature. He's a hunchback who is like his dead mother in character. I don't think he's like his father at all.
Secretly, Mr. Tulliver was pleased and proud that his son and the famous lawyer's son would be educated together. At the beginning of the next term, Tom and Philip kept their distance from each other. Philip was shy and embarrassed about his deformity, and Tom was sure that Philip must be a bad person like his father. Philip had already studied a lot and was a good student. Tom was impressed by his companion's knowledge and surprised when Philip offered to help him with his studies. Tom was puzzled to discover that the son of that devil Wakeham was in fact a pleasant companion. He also realized that Philip was much cleverer than he was, but Tom was not jealous. In his heart he felt superior to Philip because of the deformity that made him so physically weak and vulnerable. Maggie came twice to visit Tom at Mr. Stelling's. On her second visit, she and Philip became good friends. They shared a love of books and an affection for Tom. One day, when they were alone, Philip asked her,
If I were your brother, Maggie, would you love me like you love Tom?
Of course I would.
replied Maggie.
And I would love you more because I would feel sorry for you.
Seeing Philip's expression, she realized that she had said the wrong thing.
And you are so clever.
She added quickly.
I'm very fond of you, Maggie.
Philip said.
I'll always remember you and your lovely dark eyes.
Maggie studied his small, pale face.
I think you love me more than Tom does.
She smiled.
Let me kiss you, Philip.
But nobody ever kisses me,
replied Philip.
Then I will kiss you every time we meet,
promised Maggie. But the next term, Tom's friendship with Philip began to cool as the competition between the students increased. The lawsuit against the irrigation scheme had started now, and Mr. Tulliver had told Tom to stay away from Wakeham's son. There was trouble at home, and Maggie couldn't visit Mr. Stelling's any more. One morning, when Tom was near the end of his studies, he was amazed to find Maggie waiting for him in Mr. Stelling's study when he came downstairs. Maggie was now 13, but she looked older. Her face was tired, and she looked worried.
Something terrible has happened,
she said to Tom.
Father has lost the lawsuit,
guessed Tom immediately.
Yes,
she said.
But it's much worse than that. Oh, Tom, he has lost all his money, and now he's going to lose the mill too to pay his debts. But the worst thing is we think he's lost his mind. He's very ill. He doesn't recognize anyone except me. You must leave school and come home with me immediately.
The Stellings watched as Tom and Maggie walked to meet the public stagecoach that would take them home. It seemed they were walking away from their childhood into a new adult life of sorrow and trouble. Chapter 5. The Fall. On the way home, Maggie told Tom what had happened. A client of Wakeham's who had recently lent Mr. Tulliver £500 had become anxious about his money when he heard that their father was involved in an expensive lawsuit. Mr. Tulliver had promised him the contents of his house as security on the loan, but then he had lost the case and now didn't have enough money to pay the expenses. He was desperate. The worst came a few days later when he received a letter from his lawyer. It said that the man who had held the mortgage on the mill had his own financial difficulties and had now signed away the mortgage to Mr. Tulliver's old enemy, Wakeham. The shock had been so great that Mr. Tulliver had lost consciousness and had not recovered since that day. When they arrived home, Maggie and Tom were horrified to find the bailiffs in their house making an inventory of everything. Their mother was crying.
What will I do?
She sobbed.
I can't bear to lose my silver teapot and all my tablecloths. And some of these things have my name on them. Imagine the disgrace. Oh, why did I marry a man who would bring shame on my family?
For the first time, Tom began to understand that their father was directly responsible for the family's troubles and said nothing. But Maggie was furious at their mother's selfishness. The next day, all the aunts and uncles arrived at the mill for a family conference. "Well, Tom," said Mr. Glegg, "it's time to put your education to some use now. You'll have to get a job, and it will be a hard life for you."
But you must bear your father's disgrace humbly,
added Aunt Glegg.
We will buy you some simple furniture and help pay for the rent of this house. But you must be grateful and respectful to us. After all, you will inherit my money when I'm gone.
At the end of this lecture, Tom offered a suggestion.
If you gave us our inheritance now, Aunt Glegg,
he said politely,
we would be able to pay all Father's debts, and he wouldn't be bankrupt. And I could get a job and pay you back the extra money that you would have earned in interest.
Everyone was silent for a moment, amazed at Tom's maturity. But Aunt Glegg was not happy with the suggestion.
Why should I give away my fortune to keep your family in luxury, when it's obvious you can't look after money?
She said. The proud Maggie finally exploded.
My father is a better man than any of you,
she shouted.
He would have helped you if you had been in trouble. Why don't you go away and leave us alone? We can manage without your money.
The shocked aunts were more convinced than before that Maggie would bring her mother nothing but trouble. At that moment, Mrs. Moss arrived. She told the relatives that her husband owed Mr. Tulliver £300, but that he couldn't pay it back because his farm was in debt. She told Mr. Glegg that her husband had written Mr. Tulliver a note for the debt. "In that case," Mr. Glegg explained, "if Tulliver's declared bankrupt, his creditors will find the note and will force you to repay the money anyway." Tom remembered that his father had once spoken to him about this loan. He had said that he would never insist on its repayment because he didn't want his sister to suffer. After some discussion, everyone eventually agreed that they ought to look for the note and destroy it, so Mr. Glegg, Mrs. Moss, Maggie and Tom all went up to their father's room. They opened his big wooden chest to search for the note. Unfortunately, at that moment, the lid of the chest slammed shut. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Tulliver immediately sat up in bed, fully conscious, and stared at Mr. Glegg and Tom. In a normal, rational voice, he asked what was happening.
Yes, you must destroy Mr. Moss's note,
he agreed.
And Tom, you must look after your mother and sister now, and make sure you pay back every shilling that I owe. I'm sorry that you will be so poor, but it is all the lawyer's fault, not mine. And Tom, if you ever get the chance, you must have revenge on Wakeham for all this.
Then he lay back on the pillows and closed his eyes again. Chapter 6. A New Life. The next day, Tom went to visit his Uncle Dean to ask him for a job. Mr. Dean worked for Guest & Co., a shipping company that also owned some mills. Tom imagined that, like his uncle, he would rise easily in the company and quickly become a rich and respected businessman. Mr. Dean, however, was unimpressed with Tom's education at Mr. Stelling's.
That fancy education has spoiled you,
He said.
and made you unfit for hard work. When I was your age, I unloaded ships and worked in the warehouse, and I learned bookkeeping in my free time. That's the only way to succeed. You must start at the bottom and work hard. It takes a long time.
Tom was disappointed, but told his uncle that, if it would help him, he would forget his gentleman's education and try to learn more practical things. A few weeks later, Mr. Tulliver was officially declared bankrupt, and a date was fixed for the auction of the family's possessions. The children stayed upstairs with their father so that he would not notice the people downstairs. He was getting better and was beginning to remember recent events, but he was confused and believed that he had only been ill for a few days instead of 2 months. Mr. Dean eventually agreed to give Tom a clerk's job in Guest & Co.'s warehouse. When he came home in the evenings, Tom also studied bookkeeping. It was a hard life and not what he had expected for his future at all. Mrs. Tulliver found their disgrace very hard to bear. She decided that she must do something about their situation and went to visit Wakeham to ask him to be kind to her family. After all, she had no quarrel with the lawyer, she thought. It was her husband who hated him.
Perhaps he will remember the days before I married Tulliver,
She thought.
when the Dodson sisters were the most admired girls in St. Ogg's. That is sure to convince him not to be hard on us.
Wakeham was surprised to see Mrs. Tulliver and did not have much patience with her selfish silliness. However, he did learn something interesting from her ingenuous chatter. That Guest & Co. were considering buying Dorlcote Mill at the auction, and that they were willing to keep Tulliver there as the manager. Before Mrs. Tulliver's visit, Mr. Wakeham had had no intention of buying the mill himself, but now he realized that it would be a good investment, and that Tulliver would be a good employee. Best of all, the scheme would be a good way of humiliating Tulliver while appearing to be charitable. A few days later, Wakeham's bid won the auction. Mr. Tulliver wanted to leave his bed and go downstairs. His family knew that they could no longer hide the truth from him. When he saw the bare rooms of his house, he understood that he was bankrupt. Mrs. Tulliver then told him that Wakeham had bought the mill and was offering him the job of manager. Tulliver shook his head in disbelief. He was a broken man.
I can't fight any more.
He said to his wife.
I've brought you to poverty, my dear, and I'll do whatever you tell me to make it up to you.
Mrs. Tulliver wanted her husband to accept Wakeham's offer. Maggie was speechless. But Tom thought the plan was a good one. As manager, Tulliver would be able to pay back some of the money he owed, and he would also be able to stay in the mill that his grandfather had built.
Besides, the river gets angry when the mill changes owner,
said his father. That evening, however, Tulliver's mood changed. He waited for Tom to come home before making an announcement to the family.
I'll accept Wakeham's offer,
he said,
and work honestly for him, but I will never forgive him or people like him. People who get fat on others' suffering. And you must never forgive him either, Tom. Bring me the Bible.
Like most families at that time, the Tullivers recorded all births, deaths and marriages on the first page of the family Bible.
Now write in it,
he told Tom.
Write how I accepted a job and money from Wakeham, but that I will never forgive him, and that I wish him evil.
Maggie begged Tom not to do such a terrible thing, but her brother took the pen and began to write. Chapter 7. In the Red Deeps. Following the sale of the mill, the Tullivers' life became hard, dull, and monotonous. Mr. Tulliver became sullen and silent. He had lost all his pride and couldn't bear to meet other people, even if most of them, his creditors included, were friendly and sympathetic to him. Mrs. Tulliver, with an empty house and nothing to occupy her, became childish and simple-minded. Tom came home late every evening, exhausted and taciturn. The family had to economize on servants, clothes and food in order to save enough money to repay their creditors, and they grew tired and shabby as a result. Maggie found this new life unbearable. She felt that her life was finished before it had begun. She had to find a distraction to help her bear the monotony more easily. One day, searching for something to read, she found a religious book which said that the only way to achieve happiness in this world was to give up your personal desires, submit to other people, and accept your lot in life. Maggie decided that this was what she would do. She must stop thinking about herself, calm her wild spirit, and deny herself anything that she didn't need. She started sewing shirts in her free time to contribute to her family's savings, and she never spoke against Tom or her parents. Tom, too, made many sacrifices for the family. He worked hard in the warehouse and soon won the respect of his aunts and uncles. He saved most of his wages to help pay his father's creditors and gave up going out completely. He began secretly risking some of his money in cautious investments, and these investments did well. He soon began to accumulate a small sum of money, but he kept this a secret from his father. Maggie's life of strict discipline continued for the next few years. She gave up all her old pleasures except one, walking alone in the countryside. Her favourite walk took her to a place near the mill called the Red Deeps, a wild and overgrown valley that used to be a quarry. One day, when Maggie was sitting dreaming there, she was surprised to find that she was not alone, and that her companion was Philip Wakem, now 22 years old. She was pleased to see Philip again, and amazed to find out that he had never forgotten their meeting at Mr. Stelling's.
That was 5 years ago,
she said.
I was only 12 years old. Am I very different now?
Yes, you are,
Philip replied.
You are much more beautiful.
Maggie was both pleased and surprised. She had given up looking at herself in the mirror and didn't have time to think about the impression she made on other people.
I'm so sorry that we can't be friends, Philip,
she confessed sadly.
Everything from my childhood has been taken from me. My books, you, Tom and my father. Please understand that if I don't speak to you, it isn't because I don't want to, but because I know that I mustn't.
But it can't hurt anyone if we meet each other,
protested Philip.
It isn't right to deny yourself friendship.
I know now that denial is the only way that I can find peace,
she replied.
I have given up wishing for things that I can't have.
But if you give up wishing, then you give up being alive,
argued Philip.
That's what life is all about. There are lots of things that I wish for, things that other men have, and that I can never have. But if we could meet, Maggie, it would make my life more bearable.
Maggie had never imagined that Philip's request to see her was anything more than friendship. Philip could see that, and it hurt him, but he continued with his argument.
Perhaps our friendship can help make peace between our fathers. Please, let's meet here again, just once or twice a month.
Maggie could not give an answer. She ran off, telling Philip to come and find her in the Red Deeps another day, when she would let him know her decision. Philip was encouraged. He was already in love with Maggie, and he thought that if they could only spend time together, Maggie might begin to love him too. Chapter 8. Triumph and Tragedy. Maggie had decided not to meet Philip again, but after several accidental meetings in the Red Deeps, she had been unable to resist his offer of friendship. Their meetings and conversations made her feel alive again. Philip lent her books, and together they talked about literature, art, and romance. They continued to meet throughout the year, and Philip fell more and more in love with Maggie. One day he could not resist declaring his feelings.
Is it possible that you could ever love me, Maggie?
He asked.
I only ask for a little hope.
I don't think I could love anyone more than I love you.
She replied sincerely.
We could have a wonderful life together, and I know I could make you happy.
The next day, as Maggie was leaving the house for her usual walk, she was surprised to see Tom blocking the gate.
I'm going to go with you to the Red Deeps,
He said sternly.
but first, come inside with me and tell me exactly what has been happening.
Maggie learned that Aunt Pullet had mentioned seeing Philip Wakem several times, walking towards the Red Deeps. Tom had guessed that Maggie's frequent walks there could not be a coincidence. Maggie was shocked at her brother's anger and immediately told him the whole truth, including the fact that Philip had declared his love for her.
And I told him that I loved him too.
She added defiantly. Tom pretended that he was angry because of his sister's disobedience, but in fact he found her involvement with a hunchback more disgusting.
You must swear on the Bible that you will never meet or speak to him again,
He ordered.
or I will tell Father everything.
Maggie felt that Tom's treatment of her was very unjust, but she respected her brother and did as he said. Tom then forced Maggie to take him to the secret meeting place, where they found Philip waiting.
How dare you say you love my sister?
Shouted Tom furiously.
You're not worthy of her. No beautiful girl could ever love someone like you.
You can't understand the feelings I have for Maggie.
Cried Philip.
They are stronger than any feelings you could ever have.
I will take care of my sister myself.
Said Tom.
And if you ever come near her again, I'll make you suffer. I'll tell everyone about your stupid love for Maggie. How ridiculous they'll find it. How offensive.
Tom pulled Maggie away, but when they were alone, she said,
Just because I'm doing what you want, it doesn't mean that I agree with it.
she said angrily.
I will give up Philip for my father, but not for you. Perhaps I make mistakes in my life, but I make them because I have strong feelings. You have no feelings, Tom. You only care about doing what is considered right.
Over the next few weeks, Tom and Maggie spoke very little to each other. Then one day, Tom came home early with some good news. He had saved over £300 in the bank. Mr. Tulliver cried with gratitude, and the next day he and Tom went to a creditors' meeting where they repaid all the money. Now the Tulliver name was free from disgrace. Mr. Tulliver rode home in a state of great agitation, determined that the next day he would resign from his position as Wakem's manager. He was still thinking of this when he met Wakem leaving the mill on his horse. Wakem stopped to give Tulliver an order in his usual arrogant way, and the resentment of the past 4 years exploded in Tulliver. He blocked Wakem's way with his horse. Wakem's horse reared up in fear, and Wakem fell heavily to the ground. Seeing his old enemy helpless on the ground, Tulliver lost his head, and jumping from his horse, seized his whip and began to beat Wakem furiously. Maggie, who saw everything from the house, rushed outside to stop her father. Wakem freed himself from the furious Tulliver, mounted his horse, and quickly rode off, promising revenge. This final shock had been too much for Mr. Tulliver. He felt ill and exhausted. He knew that he was dying.
This is the end, Tom.
He told his son.
They've beaten me, but I'm grateful to you, son, for restoring the family name.
Is there anything that you want me to do for you, Father?
Asked Tom.
Look after your mother and your sister,
Replied the broken man.
and try to get the mill back.
An hour later, Tulliver was dead, and Maggie and Tom were clinging to each other in tears, reunited again in grief. Chapter 9. Lucy and Stephen. 2 years after Mr. Tulliver's death, Lucy Dean was sitting in her living room talking to Stephen Guest about Maggie.
The Tullivers have had terrible troubles.
She explained.
Maggie's been teaching at a girls' school,
and I've invited her to stay with me for a couple of months before she has to find another job. You must be nice to her, Stephen. I love her more than anybody in the world.
I suppose she's a fat blonde girl like her mother with nothing sensible to say,
joked Stephen. Lucy's mother, Aunt Dean, had died not long after Mr. Tulliver, and Mrs. Tulliver was now housekeeper at the Dean's house. Lucy hid her smile and wondered what he would think of her cousin. Stephen Guest was the son of the director of Guest & Co., where Mr. Dean worked. He was a rich, charming, idle young man who had no job, but one day hoped to be a member of Parliament. He and Lucy were not yet formally engaged, but their families were expecting an announcement very soon. Stephen was pleased to have found a good, pretty little girl like Lucy for his wife. Her obvious affection and concern for her poorer cousin only added to her charm. When Maggie arrived, Lucy explained that she was determined to give her a happy, carefree holiday. Maggie worked too hard, she said.
I wish I could be more like you, Lucy,
said Maggie, smiling.
You care more about other people's happiness than your own. I'm too selfish. I could never hurt anyone, but sometimes I'm so jealous of other people.
When Lucy introduced Stephen to Maggie, he was astonished. He saw a tall, dark, beautiful girl with intelligent eyes and a warm smile. He bowed formally to her, and Maggie, for the first time in her life, found herself blushing and feeling timid before a man. To Stephen's surprise, she showed no interest in compliments and polite conversation, and was more interested in talking about books and ideas. He had never met an articulate, intellectual woman before, and he was fascinated by her. Lucy was innocently delighted that her two friends seemed to like each other so much. That afternoon they all went out in a boat on the river. Stephen couldn't take his eyes off Maggie and contrived to take her hand as much as possible. At one point Maggie slipped and he saved her, putting his strong arms around her waist. Again Maggie felt a new sensation, the pleasure of being taken care of by someone stronger than herself. Later that night Lucy entered Maggie's bedroom, curious to know what she thought of Stephen.
I would like anyone that promised to make you happy, dear Lucy,
said Maggie. Lucy then confessed to Maggie that she and Stephen were good friends with Philip Wakem, but that she didn't know if she should invite him to the house while Maggie was there.
I thought that perhaps you hated him as much as Tom does,
she explained.
I don't hate him at all,
replied Maggie.
But just before my father died, I promised Tom that I would never speak to Philip again without his permission.
Lucy was so astonished by this that Maggie found herself telling Lucy everything that had happened between her and Philip. Lucy was delighted.
It's a beautiful, romantic story,
she said.
I'm sure it will all turn out well in the end.
The next day, Maggie decided to go and speak to Tom about Philip. Tom was now living near the docks with a friend, Bob Jakin. Bob confessed to Maggie that he was worried about Tom. He spends all his time alone staring into the fire, he said, and never speaks to anybody. At Christmas he was a bit happier. He asked me to find a little dog as a present for his cousin, but recently he's been very depressed. Maggie realised something then that she had never thought about before. Tom must be in love with Lucy.
I've come to ask you to free me from my promise about Philip Wakem,
she explained to him when he came home.
Lucy wants to invite him to a party at her house.
I know you will do what you want anyway,
said Tom coldly.
You could have lived with Aunt Pullet and been a lady these last 2 years, but you decided to get a job instead. Why can't you let me make the decisions? I only think of what's good for you. But remember, if you start a love affair with Philip Wakem, you will lose me.
You're too hard on me, Tom,
protested Maggie.
Haven't I kept my promise to you about not seeing Philip? And I've given up all thoughts of marrying him.
Tom finally relented.
All right,
he said.
If Lucy wants Philip to come to the house, then you may meet him there.
Chapter 10. The Temptation. Over the next few weeks, Lucy introduced Maggie to a new and exciting way of life as a society lady. They spent their days together visiting friends, taking tea, and attending parties and musical evenings. Maggie wore clothes borrowed from Lucy and Aunt Pullet, and received much admiration from the young men of St. Ogg's. These new sensations of pleasure and masculine attention were intoxicating to Maggie. Lucy noticed that Stephen, like the other men, seemed to be more animated in Maggie's company. He and Maggie enjoyed witty conversations, but Lucy was not at all jealous. Lucy did not have a suspicious nature, and anyway, she knew now that Maggie was attached to Philip. She did not know, however, how the atmosphere between Stephen and Maggie changed when she left them alone together. They became embarrassed and self-conscious immediately, and all conversation stopped. They did not even dare to look at each other. When Philip eventually came to visit, Maggie explained that Tom had freed her from her promise not to see him. She wanted to be friends with Philip again, but she was afraid that his father would object. Philip declared that he would never let his father become an obstacle to their friendship, and he felt sad when Maggie told him that she would soon go away to begin a new position as a teacher.
I must be independent,
She explained.
Tom wants to provide for me, but I can't let him do that. Anyway, this life of luxury is too much for me. There is too much temptation in it. I must give it up.
At that moment, Stephen arrived. Maggie tried to ignore him, but could not hide the thrill she felt when Stephen began to sing at the piano. Philip was watching her and started to suspect that there was some attraction between them, but he was not angry. To him it seemed natural that any man who came into contact with Maggie must love her. Meanwhile, Lucy was forming a plan that would bring Philip and Maggie closer together. She told him that Tom was trying to persuade Guest & Co. to buy Dorlcote Mill. He then hoped eventually to buy it for himself, as his father had wished. Lucy asked Philip to use his influence to persuade his father to sell the mill. They both knew that Maggie would be overjoyed to return to her old home. In fact, Mr. Wakem was pleased to sell the mill and, after the initial shock, even started to accept the idea of a relationship between Philip and Maggie. Lucy couldn't wait to tell Maggie this good news, but she was surprised and disappointed at her cousin's reaction.
I have accepted the offer of a teaching job.
Maggie repeated.
It starts in a couple of weeks.
How can you think of going away?
Asked Lucy.
When there aren't any obstacles between you and Philip now.
I would certainly marry Philip if I could.
Said Maggie.
It would be my one chance to do something noble in life. But there is still one big obstacle. Tom objects to Philip, and I can't go against my brother. I must go away.
The next night, Maggie went with Lucy to a ball at the guest's house. The music and dancing excited Maggie. For that one night, her thoughts were only about the present. She forgot about the past and refused to think about her bleak future. Between dances, Stephen persuaded Maggie to walk with him into the conservatory. They felt awkward and embarrassed and could only make polite conversation. Maggie reached up to smell a rose, and before she knew what was happening, Stephen had taken her arm and was kissing it passionately. Maggie pulled her arm back furiously.
How dare you insult me like that?
She cried angrily.
Stay away from me in the future.
Maggie felt confused and agitated. She knew then that if she was to avoid this sort of temptation, she must leave St. Ogg's as soon as possible. The next day, Philip came to visit her again. She explained that she was leaving to start her new position in another town.
Then our old past life is finished forever,
Philip said.
I will never break the ties of the past, Philip.
Said Maggie.
But the strongest tie for me is the tie to my brother.
Is that the only thing that keeps us apart?
He asked.
The only thing,
replied Maggie calmly. Philip should have been satisfied with this answer, but he could not suppress his secret angry feelings of jealousy against Tom, his old rival. Chapter 11. Carried by the Tide. A few days later, Tom finally obtained Dorlcote Mill, and Maggie went to spend a few days with her Aunt Moss to reflect on her future. One afternoon she was shocked to see Stephen riding towards the farm. He looked wild and desperate.
Maggie,
He begged as soon as they were alone together.
forgive me for the other night, but I'm mad with love for you. I'll give you everything I have, my money, my reputation, if you'll only tell me that you feel the same.
This is wicked.
Replied Maggie.
Other people are involved. We must think about them, not just ourselves.
You're engaged to Philip Wakeham, aren't you?
Stephen asked sadly.
I will never marry anyone else.
She replied firmly.
Tell me that you don't love me.
He challenged her, looking into her eyes.
Tell me that you love someone else better.
Maggie knew that she should tell Stephen that she was in love with Philip and put an end to his hopes of winning her, but her heart protested, and she could not.
If your feelings are the same as mine, it is natural that we should marry.
He continued, seeing her hesitate.
It is the only right thing to do.
I used to feel that it was right to follow strong feelings,
Said Maggie miserably.
but now I know that our duty to others is more important. If our love is wrong, we must give it up.
I'll do anything you want.
Said Stephen desperately.
Just kiss me once before we part.
They kissed, and Maggie ran inside in tears. Lucy had planned a river trip for one of Maggie's final days at St. Ogg's. She wanted Maggie and Philip to be alone together, and so at the last minute she pretended to have a headache. She didn't know that the night before Philip had seen a look of love pass between Stephen and Maggie that he could not ignore. He had spent a sleepless night and could not face Maggie that morning. He asked Stephen to go in his place. When Stephen arrived at Lucy's house, he and Maggie realised that they would be alone together for the afternoon.
Let's go on the river anyway.
He said.
It won't harm anybody.
And so they went down to the boat together. As Stephen rowed the boat and whispered words of love to Maggie, she relaxed into a dream and gave up any thought of resistance. She was only vaguely conscious of what was happening or where she was until she realised that they were much further down the river than they had planned.
What shall we do?
She cried in panic.
We won't be home for hours, and Lucy will suspect something.
Stephen let go of the oars and sat beside her.
Maggie,
He said decisively.
let's elope together. We can land at Mudport and then take the stagecoach to York. Tomorrow we can travel to Scotland and be married at Gretna Green.
Maggie protested, but Stephen insisted.
Can't you see how destiny has brought us together? Today, we belong to each other. The river is carrying us away from our old ties to a new life together.
Maggie realised that things had gone too far already. They let the tide carry them along as the sky became dark. Soon they saw a large boat behind them, and Stephen asked the captain if they could board it. It was late, and they were not as near Mudport as they had hoped. Stephen told the sailors that Maggie was his wife, and they spent the night on the deck of the boat, talking of their love and their future happiness. But when Maggie woke up the next morning, their situation seemed different in the cold light of day, and the only sensations she felt were pain and guilt. She was silent as they landed at Mudport, but when they arrived at an inn to rest, she could not hide her feelings any more.
I'm not going any further.
She said.
We must part here.
Stephen was frightened by the determination in her voice. She looked as if she had woken from a dream.
Maggie,
He cried.
you can't mean this. It will kill me.
I can't follow my impulses any further.
She said.
I'm tied to the past and to other people. I can't be happy if I make other people suffer, the people closest to me. I must give up my own pleasure for them.
But you are mine, heart and soul. We were made to be together,
Cried Stephen.
and it is too late now. People will know what we have done.
I must go home
She said.
and face everybody.
Are you mad?
He cried.
How can you go back without marrying me now?
I will confess my error, and some good will come out of it.
She said.
Go then.
He said coldly, and Maggie ran from the inn. Chapter 12. Reunited. 4 days later, Maggie returned to Dorlcote Mill, where Tom and Mrs. Tulliver were now living again. Tom was disgusted at his sister's immodest behaviour. Bob Jakin had seen her with Stephen at Mudport, and the whole town now knew that they had run away together.
"You have no home here,"
Tom said bitterly.
"I don't want to see your face. I've worked all these years to restore the family name, but you have brought us into disgrace again. I will provide for you. It is my duty, but I will not let you live in my house."
Maggie moved into Tom's old lodgings by the river with Bob's family. She was determined to stay in St. Ogg's and to try to make up for the pain she had caused. She had to prove that she was not a bad person. The parson, Dr. Ken, took pity on her and gave her a job as a teacher to his children, but most other people in St. Ogg's refused to speak to her. If she had returned as Mrs. Stephen guessed, then they might have forgiven her, but to return from such a scandalous adventure unmarried was unforgivable. All this social hypocrisy meant nothing to Maggie. She simply accepted it as part of her punishment for hurting Philip and Lucy. She only really cared about their opinion of her. Philip sent Maggie a letter saying that he forgave her and knew in his heart that she was not guilty, but Lucy had been ill since Maggie's disappearance, refusing to see anybody. However, after a letter arrived from Stephen, who had gone abroad, she began to improve. In the letter, Stephen accepted all the blame for the episode and insisted that Maggie was innocent. When Stephen's sisters offered to take Lucy to the coast for a holiday, she accepted. Shortly before they left, she decided to visit Maggie in secret. Maggie was overcome with emotion, and they embraced each other without speaking.
"I didn't mean to deceive you, Lucy,"
she said in tears.
"I know,"
said Lucy.
"Don't worry about me. It is no one's fault, and you have suffered more than me, because you chose to give Stephen up."
One night, the hot, oppressive weather of the summer erupted in heavy storms. Maggie was reading 2 letters that she had received, one from Stephen telling her that he still loved her, and another from Dr. Ken explaining that, because of gossip in the town about the nature of their relationship, he could no longer employ her. She realized that her life now was going to be nothing but a series of troubles, and she fell to her knees in despair. To her horror, she saw that there was water on the floor around her. It was the thing that the inhabitants of St. Ogg's feared most, a flood. The water began to rise with terrifying speed. As it reached her waist, something crashed through the window of Maggie's room. It was Bob's boat. She climbed out of the window and into the boat, and the current carried her swiftly away from the house. For some time she could do nothing but cling to the oars in the darkness, but as the sun started to rise, she suddenly knew that she must row to the mill and try to save her mother and brother. In the face of this terrible danger, she felt that a reconciliation with Tom was more important than anything else. The fields along the Floss were all flooded, and the river was full of wreckage, but eventually Maggie was able to recognize the landscape and find her way to the mill. The ground floor was flooded, and Tom was at an upstairs window. Her mother had gone to the pullets some days before. Tom climbed down into Maggie's boat and took over the oars. Looking at Maggie's exhausted face, he suddenly realized the effort she had made for his sake. For the first time in his life, he understood Maggie's great strength of character, and he felt humble. The only word he could speak was his childhood name for her.
"Magsy."
Further along the river, they heard people in another boat shout a warning to them. Coming towards them was an enormous pile of wreckage from the docks at St. Ogg's. They were in a strong current and could not hope to avoid it. Tom dropped the oars and held Maggie to him as their boat broke up violently, and they went under. Pieces of the boat came up again soon after, but Tom and Maggie went down in an embrace, never to be parted again. They were buried together near their father in a tomb which had this inscription: "In their death, they were not divided."